Every economics textbook tells you the same origin story. Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Modern economics was born. The Scottish philosopher became the founding father. End of story. But 399 years before Smith put pen to paper, a North African scholar sat in a castle in Algeria and wrote down a complete economic theory. Division of labor, supply and demand, optimal taxation. The rise and fall of economies in predictable cycles. His name was Ibn Khaldun. His book was the Muqaddimah, and Western academia spent 6 centuries pretending he did not exist. This is not a story about who deserves credit. Credit is for biographers and award ceremonies. This is about who controls the machinery of knowledge production. Economic theory determines tax policy. Tax policy determines wealth extraction. Wealth extraction determines who holds structural power over nations and populations. When you control the origin story of economics, you control the ideological infrastructure of global finance. You become the gatekeeper of legitimate thought. You create bottlenecks where only approved ideas flow into mainstream education, policy debates, and government decisions. You engineer a system where entire civilizations of scholarship become invisible. The exclusion of Ibn Khaldun from the Western economic canon was not an oversight. It was not a translation problem. It was not a matter of timing. It was a structural decision, reinforced across generations of academic institutions, to ensure the origin of economic thought remained European. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Here's why this matters to your life right now. Every time you hear a politician debate tax rates, they reference ideas they believe originated in the 20th century. The Laffer Curve, supply-side economics, the relationship between government revenue and tax rates. These concepts drive legislation affecting your paycheck, your health care, your retirement, and your children's education. In 1981, Arthur Laffer sat in the White House and helped design Ronald Reagan's tax policy. He cited a 14th century Arab scholar as his intellectual predecessor. Congressional records document this. News coverage from the era confirms it. White House archives preserve the paper trail. The most influential tax policy of modern America traces directly to a book written in 1377, a book your economics professor never mentioned, a thinker your textbook erased, a mind your education rendered invisible. The ideas shaping your wallet, your government's budget, and your nation's economic trajectory came from a source you were trained to ignore. For 600 years, the gatekeepers of Western knowledge decided you did not need to know where these ideas originated. Today, you learn the truth. Abd al-Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Khaldun was born in Tunis in 1332. His family had fled Seville during the Christian reconquest of Spain, carrying with them centuries of Andalusian scholarship and administrative experience. The Khaldun lineage had served as advisors to multiple Muslim dynasties across the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. By the time Ibn Khaldun was born, his family had established themselves among the intellectual elite of Tunis. His grandfather and father both held positions in the Hafsid court. They raised him within a tradition where scholarship and statecraft merged into a single discipline. He memorized the Quran by age 12. He studied Islamic jurisprudence, philosophy, logic, and mathematics under the leading scholars of Tunis. When the Black Death swept through the city in 1348, it killed his parents and most of his teachers. He was 16 years old. The plague did not break him. It sharpened him. Watching a third of his city die gave him an early education in the fragility of civilizations. Empires rose, plagues fell, societies collapsed, survivors rebuilt. The pattern repeated across centuries. By age 20, Ibn Khaldun entered the service of the Hafsid Sultan as a calligrapher and seal-bearer. This was the beginning of a political career spanning decades, multiple dynasties, and nearly every major power center in the Islamic West. He served the Marinid sultans of Fez. He advised the Nasrid rulers of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. He worked for the Hafsid dynasty in Tunis, the Zayyanid rulers of Tlemcen, and eventually the Mamluk sultans of Egypt. He held positions as ambassador, chief justice, and court advisor. He was imprisoned twice. He fell in and out of favor with rulers who valued his intelligence but feared his ambition. This was not the life of a detached academic theorizing from a library. Ibn Khaldun watched governments function and fail from the inside. He saw how taxation destroyed productive economies. He observed how luxury corrupted ruling dynasties. He witnessed how tribal solidarity built empires, and how urban comfort dismantled them. Every economic theory he developed came from direct observation of how states actually operated. His laboratory was the entire medieval Islamic world. In 1375, exhausted by decades of political intrigue, Ibn Khaldun retreated to the castle of Ibn Salama in the mountains of Algeria. He needed isolation. He needed time. He needed to write down everything he had learned about why civilizations rise and fall. Over the next 4 years, he produced the Muqaddimah. The title translates as The Introduction. It was intended as the opening volume of a larger universal history, but the introduction itself ran to over 400,000 words. It became the first systematic analysis of economics, sociology, and political science in human history. He completed the Muqaddimah in 1377. He was 45 years old. Adam Smith would not be born for another 346 years. The book did not emerge from abstract speculation. It emerged from watching kingdoms collapse under bad tax policy. It emerged from seeing how trade routes created wealth and how monopolies destroyed markets. It emerged from decades of asking a single question: why do some societies flourish while others decay? His answer was not religious, it was not moral, it was structural. Ibn Khaldun opened his economic analysis with a statement Western economists would not articulate for 4 centuries. Labor is the source of all value. He wrote in the Muqaddimah, translated by Franz Rosenthal in 1958, the following: all the acquired means of livelihood and all the crafts are the result of the labor expended on them. The value of goods derives from the labor required to produce them. A farmer's wheat has value because of the labor of plowing, planting, and harvesting. A craftsman's furniture has value because of the labor of cutting, shaping, and assembling. This is the labor theory of value. Karl Marx would make the same argument in 1867 in Das Kapital. Economics textbooks credit Marx as the originator. They do not mention Ibn Khaldun stated it clearly in 1377. But Ibn Khaldun went further. He understood labor alone did not explain prices. Supply and demand determined what buyers would pay. He wrote, again in the Muqaddimah, observations about how prices function in markets. When grain is abundant after a good harvest, prices fall. When grain is scarce after drought, prices rise. The same applies to manufactured goods. When craftsmen produce more textiles than buyers need, prices drop. When demand exceeds supply, prices increase. This is supply and demand dynamics. Alfred Marshall formalized these concepts in his 1890 Principles of Economics. Economics textbooks treat Marshall and earlier thinkers like Smith as the originators. Ibn Khaldun described the same mechanisms 5 centuries before Marshall was born. He also analyzed the division of labor and its relationship to economic output. Ibn Khaldun observed in Tunis, Fez, and Cairo how urban economies functioned. Larger cities supported greater specialization. A small village might have one blacksmith who made everything from nails to horseshoes to plows. A large city had nail makers, horseshoe specialists, and plow manufacturers as separate trades. This specialization increased productivity. The nail maker who made only nails became faster and more skilled than the village blacksmith who made everything. The total output of the city exceeded what the same number of workers would produce without specialization. Adam Smith famously illustrated this concept with his pin factory example in The Wealth of Nations. One worker making pins alone produces 20 pins per day. 10 workers dividing the labor into separate steps produce 48,000 pins per day. Smith published this in 1776. Ibn Khaldun had explained the same principle 4 centuries earlier using examples from North African textile production and metalworking. But the economic insight with the most direct impact on modern policy was his theory of optimal taxation. Ibn Khaldun observed across multiple dynasties a consistent pattern in how taxation affected state revenue. At the beginning of a dynasty, tax rates were low. Rulers had recently conquered their territory. They needed the support of the population. They taxed lightly. Under light taxation, the economy flourished. Farmers invested in their land. Merchants expanded their trade. Craftsmen trained apprentices. The tax base grew. Even with low rates, total government revenue increased because there was more economic activity to tax. As dynasties aged, rulers became accustomed to luxury. They needed more revenue to fund their courts, their armies, and their construction projects. They raised tax rates. At first, higher rates brought in more money, but past a certain point, the relationship reversed. Farmers stopped investing because the government would take their gains. Merchants reduced their trade because profits disappeared into taxation. Craftsmen abandoned their trades because hard work no longer paid. The economy contracted. The tax base shrank. Despite higher rates, total revenue declined. The government had passed the point of optimal taxation. Ibn Khaldun described this dynamic with precision. He wrote in the Muqaddimah, according to Rosenthal's translation, at the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments. This is the Laffer Curve. Arthur Laffer drew it on a napkin in a Washington restaurant in 1974, using it to argue for Reagan's tax cuts. He presented it as a breakthrough insight in supply-side economics. 6 years later in White House meetings, Laffer acknowledged Ibn Khaldun as his predecessor. The new idea shaping American tax policy was 6 centuries old. Economics for Ibn Khaldun was not an isolated discipline. It was part of a larger system explaining how human societies form, grow, peak, and collapse. His theory of civilizational cycles integrated economic analysis with sociology. political science, and history in a way no Western thinker would attempt until the 19th century. The key concept was asabiya. The word has no direct English translation. Scholars render it as group solidarity, social cohesion, or tribal feeling. It describes the bonds connecting members of a group and motivating them to sacrifice individual interests for collective success. Ibn Khaldun observed Berber tribes in the Maghreb, Arab nomads in the desert, and urban populations in cities. The tribes had strong asabiya. Members shared hardship. They defended each other. They worked together. Their cohesion gave them military strength disproportionate to their numbers. Urban populations had weak asabiya. City dwellers pursued individual comfort. They hired soldiers instead of fighting themselves. They competed against neighbors instead of cooperating. Their sophistication came with fragmentation. This explained how empires formed. A tribal group with strong asabiya conquered a wealthy but fragmented urban civilization. The vigorous outsiders took control of the prosperous center. A new dynasty began. The first generation of rulers remembered the desert. They maintained discipline. They kept taxation low. They understood the source of their strength. The second generation grew up in palaces. They learned about hardship from stories, not experience. They began to soften. The third generation knew only luxury. They hired mercenaries to replace the tribal warriors. They raised taxes to fund their lifestyles. They lost connection to the source of their power. By the fourth generation, the dynasty was hollow. Its asabiya had dissolved. Somewhere on the frontier, a new tribal group with strong cohesion was watching. The cycle prepared to repeat. Ibn Khaldun argued this cycle took approximately 4 generations, or about 120 years. He documented it across every dynasty he had studied in Islamic history. The pattern held from the Umayyads to the Abbasids to the smaller kingdoms of his own era. The economic dimension of this cycle was central. Each stage had distinct economic characteristics. The founding stage featured low taxation, economic expansion, and growing prosperity. Rulers and ruled shared sacrifice. The economy grew. The building stage saw continued growth, increasing specialization and urban development. The dynasty constructed palaces, mosques, and infrastructure. Trade flourished. This was the peak of productivity. The luxury stage brought increasing taxation, growing inequality, and the emergence of a parasitic elite. The dynasty extracted wealth rather than creating conditions for its production. Debt accumulated. Speculation replaced productive investment. The collapse stage witnessed economic contraction, popular resentment, military weakness, and vulnerability to conquest. The tax base had been destroyed. The treasury was empty. The population was resentful. The frontier tribes were ready. This was not a moral argument about the evils of luxury. It was a structural analysis of how economic incentives changed across the life cycle of political systems. The founding generation had incentives aligned with economic growth. The final generation had incentives aligned with extraction. Arnold Toynbee would develop similar civilizational cycle theories in his 12-volume A Study of History published between 1934 and 1961. Oswald Spengler would propose comparable ideas in The Decline of the West in 1918. Both would be credited as originators of cyclical history. Neither mentioned Ibn Khaldun as a predecessor, despite his work being available in European libraries for centuries. The pattern held. Western academia credited Western thinkers. Islamic scholarship remained invisible. Ibn Khaldun did not remain entirely unknown in Europe. His work reached Western scholars through multiple channels over several centuries. The exclusion was not from lack of access, it was from lack of recognition. The first European reference to Ibn Khaldun appeared in the 17th century. Barthélemy d'Herbelot included an entry on him in his 1697 Bibliothèque Orientale, an encyclopedic work on Islamic civilization. D'Herbelot summarized the Muqaddimah and acknowledged its scope. The entry was brief. It sparked no sustained interest. In 1806, Sylvestre de Sacy, the leading French Arabist of his era, published excerpts from the Muqaddimah in his Chrestomati Arabe. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign had created European appetite for Islamic texts. De Sacy recognized the economic content. He translated passages on taxation and the rise and fall of dynasties. French intellectuals read these excerpts. The insights did not enter mainstream economic discourse. The first complete European translation came in 1858. William McGuckin de Slane published a French edition under the title Les Prolegomènes d'Ibn Khaldun. The translation ran to 3 volumes. It was thorough, accurate, and available to any European scholar who cared to read it. John Stuart Mill had published his Principles of Political Economy 10 years earlier. The entire edifice of classical economics had been constructed without reference to Ibn Khaldun. Now his complete work sat in European libraries. Economists ignored it. The reasons were multiple. Language barriers remained significant. Most economists did not read French academic translations of medieval Arabic texts. Disciplinary boundaries had hardened. Economics had separated from history and philosophy into its own specialization. Economic historians focused on European commerce and industry. Islamic scholarship was relegated to Oriental studies departments, where it was treated as cultural artifact rather than living intellectual tradition. And ideology played its role. European colonialism was at its peak. The narrative of Western superiority required Europe to be the origin of modern thought. Acknowledging an Arab Muslim as the founder of economic science contradicted the story colonial powers needed to tell about themselves and the civilizations they were conquering. The first serious Western academic treatment came in 1930. Charles Issawi published An Arab Philosophy of History, which analyzed the Muqaddimah as social science. Issawi was himself of Middle Eastern origin, born in Cairo and educated in England. His work appeared in a scholarly journal. It did not reach mainstream economics. Joseph Spengler's Economic Thought of Islam, Ibn Khaldun, appeared in Comparative Studies in Society and History in 1964. Spengler was a respected economic historian at Duke University. He systematically compared Ibn Khaldun's theories to Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. He documented priority on multiple concepts. The American Economic Review and other major journals did not pick up the thread. Jean-David Boulakia published Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century economist, in the Journal of Political Economy in 1971. Boulakia was explicit. He wrote, according to his article, observations comparing Ibn Khaldun to Smith on division of labor, to Marshall on supply and demand, and to modern public finance theorists on optimal taxation. He concluded Ibn Khaldun had anticipated the major insights of Western economics by centuries. The Journal of Political Economy was a premier publication. Boulakia's article was peer-reviewed and well-documented. It should have transformed how economics was taught. Nothing changed. Graduate programs continued ignoring Islamic contributions. The gatekeepers held the gates. Then came 1981. Arthur Laffer had been promoting supply-side economics since the mid-1970s. His argument centered on the curve bearing his name. Tax rates and government revenue did not move in a straight line. At zero taxation, revenue was zero. At 100% taxation, revenue was also zero because no one would work if the government took everything. Somewhere between these extremes was an optimal point where revenue reached its maximum. Laffer joined the Reagan economic team. He advised on the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, which slashed income tax rates. In meetings and congressional testimony, he cited his intellectual predecessors. One of them was Ibn Khaldun. Laffer acknowledged in interviews and public statements, documented in contemporary news coverage, his debt to the 14th century scholar. He quoted the Muqaddimah on how dynasties destroyed their economies through excessive taxation. He positioned himself not as an innovator, but as a rediscoverer of ancient wisdom. The acknowledgement was public. It was documented. It appeared in major newspapers and policy journals. And still, economics textbooks did not change. The footnote about Ibn Khaldun appeared in specialized articles on the history of economic thought. It did not make the introductory chapters of standard texts. Why did acknowledgement not lead to integration? Why does Ibn Khaldun remain absent from the education of economists, business leaders, and policymakers? The answer lies in how academic canons are constructed and maintained. A canon is not a list of the best or most original thinkers. It is an infrastructure of power. It determines whose ideas count as legitimate foundations and whose ideas count as curiosities or footnotes. Canon formation involves multiple gatekeeping mechanisms. Textbook authors decide which thinkers to include in introductory surveys. These surveys shape what every student in the field learns as baseline knowledge. Graduate programs design comprehensive exams around canonical figures. Students who want degrees must master the approved list. Hiring committees evaluate candidates based on engagement with canonical debates. Scholars who focus on non-canonical figures find fewer job opportunities. Each gatekeeping layer reinforces the others. Textbooks exclude Ibn Khaldun because graduate programs ignore him. Graduate programs ignore him because hiring committees do not reward expertise in his work. Hiring committees do not reward this expertise because textbooks have not established him as foundational. Breaking into an established canon requires more than demonstrating intellectual merit. It requires changing the incentive structures across an entire discipline. The forces resisting this change are substantial. First, acknowledgement would require rewriting the origin story of economics as a discipline. This is not a minor revision. It means admitting the foundational narrative taught for generations was wrong. It means telling professors their doctoral training was incomplete. It means telling the public the experts were misinformed. Institutions resist admitting error. The larger the error and the longer it persisted, the greater the resistance. Second, integration would force engagement with non-Western intellectual traditions on equal terms. This threatens hierarchies built on the assumption of European and American intellectual superiority. It opens questions about what else might have been excluded. If Ibn Khaldun was overlooked, who else was erased? Third, the scholars who specialize in canonical Western economists have career investments in maintaining the current structure. Their expertise, their publications, their professional identities center on figures like Smith, Ricardo, Keynes, and Friedman. Elevating Ibn Khaldun does not enhance their status. It dilutes it. These are not conscious conspiracies. They are structural pressures operating through thousands of individual decisions. Each textbook author, each hiring committee, each graduate program makes choices shaped by incentives the current system creates. The result is an architecture of exclusion requiring no coordinating authority. Ibn Khaldun's case reveals this architecture with particular clarity because his ideas so directly parallel canonical Western economists. This is not a claim for including diverse perspectives as supplementary material. This is a claim for priority. He published the core insights first, by 4 centuries. The resistance to integrating him, therefore, exposes what the canon defends. Not intellectual merit, not chronological priority, not explanatory power. The canon defends a particular story about where legitimate knowledge originates. It defends European and American ownership of the foundations of modern thought. Your economics education was not incomplete by accident. It was incomplete by design. The design served specific functions. It reinforced the legitimacy of Western institutions as sources of authoritative knowledge. It created demand for Western-trained economists as the experts qualified to advise governments worldwide. It positioned former colonial powers as intellectual leaders in former colonies, as followers who needed to learn from the metropole. These functions continue operating today. When the International Monetary Fund advises developing nations on tax policy, it does so with frameworks traced to Smith and Laffer. Ibn Khaldun does not appear in IMF training materials. When the World Bank evaluates economic governance, it uses metrics developed by Western economists. The 14th century analysis of how taxation affects production is not part of the assessment toolkit. Yet the ideas circulate anyway. They entered modern policy through the supply-side revolution of the 1980s. They shaped tax legislation in the United States, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other countries. They influenced a generation of economic thinking. The ideas were used. The source was not honored. The pattern is familiar to anyone who studies how dominant powers extract resources from subordinate ones. You now face a choice about what to do with this knowledge. You could treat it as an interesting historical footnote, a trivia fact for dinner party conversations. Did you know the Laffer Curve was invented in the 14th century? Or you could recognize what it reveals about the systems shaping your understanding of the world. Your education was filtered. The filters served interests. Those interests were not yours. The economists advising your government learned from textbooks that erased contributions from outside the Western tradition. Their frameworks carry blind spots embedded at the foundational level. When they analyze why developing nations struggle economically, they use theories disconnected from the longest continuous tradition of economic thought in human history. Ibn Khaldun understood something modern economists are still relearning. Economic systems do not operate independently from social cohesion, political legitimacy, and civilizational cycles. You cannot analyze taxation without analyzing how dynasties rise and fall. You cannot understand markets without understanding the sociology of urban and rural life. You cannot predict economic futures without understanding how luxury corrupts and how solidarity builds. His framework was holistic. Modern economics fragmented his insights into isolated disciplines. Sociology took asabiya. Political science took the cycle of dynasties. Economics took supply and demand. None of them credited their source. The fragmentation itself was a loss. Ibn Khaldun's integrated approach explained connections. Modern disciplines struggle to see because they no longer speak to each other. Right now, developed economies display the markers Ibn Khaldun identified as late-stage civilizational patterns: growing inequality, rising debt, speculation replacing productive investment, elites extracting rather than creating wealth, populations losing trust in institutions, the tax base eroding as the wealthy find ways to escape contribution. His analysis predicted these patterns. He saw them in 14th century North Africa. He documented how they led to collapse and replacement by more vigorous societies. The question is not whether his cycle theory applies to modern conditions. The question is whether we will learn from a 600-year-old warning or repeat the pattern he documented. Begin by recognizing what was taken from your education. Then recover what was lost. Read the Muqaddimah. Franz Rosenthal's translation remains available through Princeton University Press. The economic chapters are accessible to anyone with basic literacy. You do not need an economics degree to understand them. Ibn Khaldun wrote for educated readers, not specialists. Demand better from your educational institutions. When economics courses begin with Adam Smith as the founder, ask about Ibn Khaldun. When textbooks omit Islamic contributions to economic thought, question the omission. The gatekeepers hold power only as long as no one challenges their gates. Recognize the pattern when you see it in other fields. If economics erased a 14th century founder for 6 centuries, what have other disciplines erased? What other origin stories need examination? What other canons serve power rather than truth? Ibn Khaldun spent 4 years in an Algerian castle, writing down everything he had learned about how human societies work. He did not write for fame. He wrote because he understood something true and wanted it preserved. 6 centuries later, his ideas shaped tax policy affecting billions of people. His name remains absent from most textbooks teaching those ideas. The historical record exists. The manuscripts sit in libraries from Istanbul to Princeton. The evidence is documented. The translations are available. What was hidden is now findable. What was excluded is now accessible. What was stolen is now recoverable. The founders of modern economic thought included a 14th century North African Muslim scholar who served at the courts of kings across the Islamic world. He saw empires rise and fall. He understood why. He wrote it down. He was the first modern economist the Western canon chose to remember. Now you know who came before him.